Welcome everyone. We are live here on the show, and today we're going to be discussing censorship. We're asking the question, has Australia and New Zealand, have they gone full Orwell? Because there are lots of things going on there in terms of censorship that are kind of remarkable. I've invited onto the show Alex Saunders of Nuggets News. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Naomi. I'm looking forward to diving into these topics because it is changing landscape in Australia at the moment.
It is a changing landscape, and you know what? I think so many of us think to Australia and New Zealand in particular, and kind of we hold them up on this pedestal, and we sort of think about them as these bastions of freedom for a bunch of different reasons. Basically, because they've been really great countries for a long time, and they've been right up there in the Economic Freedom Index. It's been pretty easy to live over there, very free countries. And I've seen this trend in the last few years that just makes me second guess all of these assumptions and makes me realize how fragile freedom is, because you just see it disappearing so quickly over there. So let's dive right into some of the things that are going on. So recently, let's just talk about this for a second. New Zealand, absolutely heartbreaking what's going on there at the moment with the shooting. Like 50 people I think are dead, and it's just absolutely awful. And then what the government's decided to do was a lot of private internet service providers decided that they wanted to censor the video. So they announced, we will not be releasing this video. You won't not be able to read it. It was basically this live stream of the shooter. And I think that right off the bat, I think it's perfectly reasonable for a private company to decide whether or not they're going to be hosting something like that. So I'll just go ahead and say that. And I can totally see why they wouldn't want to spread that stuff around, I don't know, did you look into what was happening there and this guy's manifesto and everything going on there?
Yeah, so I got sent that link, like a lot of people, about what had happened, and it was a tragic news. And then you found out it was Australian as well, and it makes your heart break even more. But that video obviously circulated, and we don't want that on the 6 o'clock news for children to see and that sort of thing. But when it got blocked and people being threatened with going to jail for circulating that link,
well, then it became a government issue, right? It wasn't just the private internet service providers who were like, we're choosing not to do this, which again I think is fine. When you had the government and the New Zealand government, that was shocking. When the New Zealand jumped in and government jumped in and said, this teenager who has shared this video, this is illegal for him to do so. He's going to get 14 years in jail. In what world is that a rational response to sharing a video?
yeah, I think you have to kind of ask, well, where do you draw the line? What are you allowed to share online and what aren't you allowed to share? And those list of websites that got blocked, and it's like, hold on, all of a sudden, who's making these decisions? Some of these websites are important to people to read their news or to run their business and so on. So yeah, where do you draw the line about torrenting and who can share what and freedom of information? I guess that's the topic to debate, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's a very complicated discussion, right? Because I totally understand how if you want to deter activity, then have a harsh penalty for carrying out that activity. Sharing a video. Right, so this is it's a delicate topic. You have a lot of lives that have just been destroyed. You have this video, and the shooter clearly wants this video to get out. That's why he live streamed it. I think that at the time about 200 people were watching, but then since then lots and lots of people just tuning in and making and seeing that. And so the government kind of stepped in quickly and said, okay, this is illegal, blanket ban. But now you're dealing with this teenage kid who potentially could be going to jail for 14 years for sharing a video. If you just isolate what we're dealing with there and just say, okay, this is what he's done, this is the punishment for that, you've got to take a step back and just start to question, who's on the side of good here? A teenage kid who's sharing a video getting sent to jail for 14 years. I know that we talk a lot about China's censorship and how outrageous it is, and I know for decades we're talking about, oh gosh, you can't mention Tiananmen Square in China. You know, it's so censored what information people get hold of. That's terrible. I think Taylor Swift, she couldn't even sell her merchandise that said 1989, which was her her album from 2014. They couldn't sell that there. The merchandise that said TS 1989, because the Chinese government was like, no, we won't even allow that. And we kind of get like very self-righteous when we look at countries that are censoring information and things that are going on, and then suddenly Australia and New Zealand are doing the exact same thing now.
Yeah, and I think governments live in their ivory towers and decide that they're going to stamp something and say that's illegal, but people have the power. We are the weight of numbers, and we've seen it with all sorts of things like the drug war. Drugs are still everywhere. Sharing content, it's banned, but everyone still does it in a lot of ways. And yeah, I just definitely think that they get on their high horse and say, you can do this, you can't do this, we've decided this overnight. And then it's kind of like, well, what law are you applying here? When did this happen? And as you say, Australia's gone from a lucky country, a free country, to implementing things like the social credit score and monitoring in Sydney, all this sort of thing. And
wait, there's a social credit score in Sydney?
So, in China, how they have the social credit system and the facial recognition and
monitoring.
Yeah,
because we talk about it and bag it all the time and say how atrocious it is. Australia has implemented this same... No, please tell me that's incorrect.
Yeah,
please.
No, I did read the other day they are trialling this in the Sydney CBD. And again, it's one of those things about, do you have to wear a hat and a beanie if you don't want your face and all that being collected? So... I was honestly shocked, as you were, because it was only on Zero Hedge and those articles about China doing it, and then literally a few days later Sydney came out and said we are going to trial this in some areas or whatnot as well. I couldn't believe it was happening in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you're talking about censoring the sharing of information, it's a really loaded subject, right? Because it's not black or white. In America, there's freedom of speech, and we have that protected, and that's sort of upheld as something that everyone believes in. And in Australia, we don't have that. That's never something where we're like, oh, First Amendment rights. You never hear anyone saying, like, as a principle, this is something we're allowed to do. And so then you have the government that has exercised a lot of freedom with censoring content, right? So rather than talking about the specific video of the shooting, let's talk about it in a broader sense, about the philosophy of being able to censor information, censor videos, stop people spreading information, because it's such an important topic. And it's exactly what you started to talk about there. This idea of you have these elite people who are in control, and who's at the top of the chain there? Who are the ones who are deciding which content is and isn't allowed to be shown? Because once you have people who wield that amount of power, that's an incredible amount of power that can easily be leveraged to certain people's advantage for particular agendas. It can be corrupted. That is something that I think that no government should walk down. That's a street that you should stay clear of.
Yeah, and we saw the Five Eyes Alliance recently with all the encryption laws in Australia. They chose Australia to base it out of because we don't have that freedom of information and First Amendment rights and so on. So I think if we go back and talk about the Industrial Revolution and the way that information was shared, and it started as, religious establishments had a lot of power and got to choose what information was printed and shared, and then we had more information being able to be created and shared, and then we had the internet invented, and now we both talk a lot about cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin has changed the way that we can exchange value peer-to-peer. But now we see Ethereum and all these blockchains and these web-based projects that are trying to change the way data is shared. And just as we saw with that video the other day, we had Library, Cent, BitTube, DTube, all these other platforms where we can share stuff peer-to-peer. And one by one, people are saying, hold on, we aren't going to be on Facebook and these other platforms if they keep censoring what we're doing. Just the other day, YouTube decided that UFO videos, 9/11 videos, conspiracy stuff they're not going to show it anymore in their search results, and their algorithms aren't going to push it. It's just crazy
Wow.
what they're deciding what can and can't be viewed. And I think people are going to slowly go to those other platforms.
Absolutely. And of course, when we're talking about platforms like YouTube, again, it's totally within their right to ban whatever content they want, to lower the results for whatever content they want. They're a private company, they can do what they want. I think that the point that's most important that you raised is that now people have choices. Like, if you don't like them doing some of those things, sometimes you can fight them and get them to change their policy, or sometimes you can support better systems that don't censor videos, and you can support some of these smaller platforms.
This has come about because people have thought, oh, these are great platforms to interact with our peers. And now people are realizing that no, when you post something on YouTube or Facebook or put money in a bank, for example, it is theirs. It becomes legally their content or their possession. And now with these peer-to-peer platforms, we're trying to take back ownership of our own data.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about Australia and the way that they've dealt with censorship in the past, because it is not really a free country in that respect. So WikiLeaks actually published in 2009. They published a leaked Australian blacklist that revealed all of the banned sites by the government. So this is the ACMA. They put out this blacklist, and some of the things on the blacklist is kind of crazy. So about half of the sites apparently on the list, and this was 2009, WikiLeaks says that about half of them were not related to child porn. This was what the government was saying, that, oh, we need to ban this content, we need to filter the internet and all of this. Well, this is what you get when you filter the internet. They said that about half the sites aren't related to child porn. Some of them include a slew of online poker sites. There are some YouTube links. There are some regular gay and straight porn sites. There are Wikipedia entries. There are euthanasia sites. There are websites on fringe religions, such as satanic sites. There are fetish sites. There are Christian sites, and the website of a tour operator, and there's even a Queensland dentist that apparently was on this blacklist. So there's a whole lot of things that are being banned that we're probably not aware of, and the fact that the government has the ability to filter the internet and decide whether or not some things can be seen and some things aren't. I mean, you can definitely see right off the bat the slippery slope that is. Like, as soon as you have a political opinion that is not in line with what the present government is saying, is that going to be shut down, right? And of course that happens all the time. This isn't some speculation that's wild and fanciful. This happens all the time. So they added to the blacklist several WikiLeaks pages as well. So that falls right into step with the idea of a government not liking certain political views that are being shared. And apparently the Australian government was like the third country in the world to ban the certain WikiLeaks sites. The other ones were China and United Arab Emirates. So I mean, that's just insane that Australia, that we consider in our minds, oh, it's this free country, they're following the steps of China. They're one of three countries to actually choose to censor this. This is kind of crazy.
I think you'd have to agree that our government has just become so out of touch with reality. We spoke about that ivory tower before, and our government now is in a lot of ways just viewed as this old, so out of touch with the millennials and the way the world works at the moment. And when they block these sites, I sort of picture it as a hole in a damn wall, and they're plugging over one by one, and what they create is a critical mass where that water will eventually rise over the dam and overflow, and people learn about how to use a VPN. The government's blocking all this stuff. It's like telling a teenage kid they can't do something. It makes them want to do it more. And people are pretty smart and savvy these days. They know how to use these encrypted chat apps or use the alternate platforms, use VPNs. And I think the government, again, they just live in their little world thinking, oh, we've blocked that site and no one used it, no one's going to go there anymore. But it's just creating more and more people that are anti-establishment. And that's why we see things like Brexit, Trump, yellow vests. And I think people are going to be shocked to what could happen in Australia if we have a bit of an economic slowdown and, as I say, unemployment rises and people start to get angry with the way the government has done things. And I think we could see something similar to the yellow vests in Australia.
I think that we really need to talk about that, because that's really important. What happens to speech when you suppress it? Does it disappear? I had this conversation with someone about 6 months ago. I was at a crypto conference, and we both said the same sentence, and then realized shortly thereafter that we meant completely different things. So we were talking about whether or not speech should ever be banned, and he said, when you have free speech, it leads to things like Trump, when you suppress suppressing speech is a huge issue because of things like Trump, and I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And then he explained what he meant. He meant that during the 2016 election, we should have been suppressing speech, because instead allowing it in the open allowed it to bloom, and it got all this support, and then it led to, terrible presidents like Trump. And I was like, whoa, no, I felt it was the complete opposite. I still think that freedom of speech had a lot to do with it, but I think it was the suppression of certain topics. It was the fact that some things are so taboo and are pushed down by major news outlets and social media, and things are censored by private platforms, but it's become this overarching thing, where there's no real choices where you can go. And because of that suppression of free speech, that led to something that was festering, and these people didn't have an outlet, and so you became kind of radicalized and went to this candidate that everyone thought was this joke candidate at the time. No one took seriously, but they were like, no, let's go with this guy who's so anti-establishment, wants to drain the swamp. It seems that throughout history, anything that is prohibited just becomes this festering undercurrent in society. That's never what you want. You want dialogues out in the open. You want discussions where people can actually learn, hear two sides, and are not shut down immediately. Because even when we're not talking about speech, when you had prohibition of alcohol, what happened? You didn't shut out the alcohol. It didn't just get rid of alcohol and people were like, oh, well, no alcohol. Instead, it led to this undercurrent, people doing it in secret, and it led to this nefarious activity. It became a lot more violent to get alcohol or to sell alcohol. It became totally ruled by mobs. It's never good to suppress these things.
The US election was so interesting as an Australian and outside looking in, and you have people that thought Trump's too obnoxious, and then people that thought he's a good businessman. But then, as you say, you had for the first time people that it was, who's the greater enemy? It was Trump talking down Hillary and the Clintons' corruption. It was like, well, they're voting against one rather than voting for a person in the election. And I think those points you bring up are really important, and that's what led me down the rabbit hole when I was studying pharmacy and learning about how drugs work, and then you go down that path of corruption and big pharma, and as you say, all these places where drugs are illegal, and it creates these big black markets and crime. And then we see now clearly that all the evidence shows that legalizing drugs and having good support systems leads to far better results. But finally, the US is starting to look to legalize marijuana, but I think Australia is probably years behind the eight ball on that. And I think just the decriminalisation of drugs is something that common sense and science is showing us needs to be done, and yet all these countries like Australia are years behind the eight ball.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And it's so sad to see how far things have gone, because I've talked a lot on the show about the anti-encryption laws as well. And there just seems to be a trend going on in Australia where the culture seems to be okay with people censoring others and kind of controlling action and what information people are allowed to share. And they seem all right with giving up their rights to private conversations. It doesn't seem like it's an important thing to a lot of people, because this anti-encryption bill came through, which gave these vaguely worded rules that gave the government huge amounts of power, very little accountability, about putting backdoors in devices and making encryption, a thing of the past in Australia, so that people can't have private conversations anymore. That stuff. The fact that I didn't see many people up in arms about that, the mainstream media definitely wasn't talking about it. So I'm just like, oh wow, who are they under the thumb of? And it's just so sad to not see people fighting that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and we had a meeting the other day with Treasury to talk about the future of the blockchain industry and the tech industry, and they're focusing on a few things. And Australia doesn't score well with its tax rates. It's not attractive for tech startups. Regulation and the encryption laws have made it very unattractive for startups, and they're just not sure how they're going to be treated if they're raising money in this country, and a few other issues to do with blockchain more than the tech industry. So I think Australia is just pushing away talent, and we talk to the startups in this space and they say it's very hard to attract people to Sydney, to Australia, even on high incomes, because a number of reasons now. But that encryption law, as you say, why would a tech startup have their base in Australia when the government can ask them to build a backdoor into their app, their data, and it's illegal? They're going to go to jail if they don't comply. It's just crazy.
Absolutely. And there are huge sentences, like jail and giant fine. Like, it's not in a company's best interest to go against the government if they ask for these things. So it really is disincentivizing much.
And the government have literally come out and said, joking, that the laws of mathematics don't apply in Australia. The Australian government are above the laws of mathematics, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you've got the encryption stuff, you've got this censorship that's going on. And again, we have to ask the question, you know, like, I'm already looking at the sites here. Like, there are abortion sites that are on the blacklist. There are euthanasia sites that are on the blacklist. The government is literally filtering the internet in Australia the same way that China is filtering the internet, and yet we still think of Australia as this, you know, beautiful, shining beacon of freedom, and we think of China as, oh, well, they're very oppressive and they shut down free speech and that's bad. And there seems to be this huge cognitive dissonance there. Can you explain why that is? Is it just that, you know, with propaganda tools, we've done such a great job at, like, pretending, like, holding Australia up as this paradigm of freedom? Like, I mean, what's it going to take to get people to get a sense of what's actually going on in reality?
Well, yeah, people are going to hit a critical mass where there's issues come up where they don't agree with what the government's banned. And just like we saw, you know, marriage equality, all of a sudden it gets over the line. And as you say there, I think you mentioned, you know, some gay websites that have been banned. Well, all of a sudden it's going to be a topic that's a little bit more mainstream, that has a bit more critical mass behind it. And people are going to say, well, when did the government start to decide what is and isn't acceptable in our country? And all of a sudden you have those little fringe, you know, regions become one, because they're all saying, well, hold on, the government is suppressing all these little areas. We're all fighting for freedom together. And that's when you get some yellow vests and people marching against the government when they make one wrong decision too many.
Right, and let's talk a little bit about what you touched on earlier. So it seems very bleak what we're saying. You know, all of this censorship, it's just stifling. It's probably going to lead to some awful uprising and or some violence or unnecessary violence. You know, and that could be the case. But I think we're missing the bigger picture. And you alluded to it before. You're talking about VPNs, etc. We're at a stage now where you have governments around the world who are telling people what is and isn't allowed. Now, you've had this case in this applies to, like, 3D printed gun laws in America. You have the government fighting with defense distributors, saying, you know, are we allowed to publish blueprints for 3D printed guns that people can make at home? And they were arguing, you know, this is speech, etc., and this should be allowed. And this whole argument really just sidesteps the issue that 3D printed technology is a reality now. Just decentralized social media platforms are reality now. Blockchain technology with immutable ledgers and data records are a reality now. So these tables have turned, and no one is talking about the giant paradigm shift where government does not have the power to dictate these actions anymore. They're still there saying you can do this and you can't do that, and they don't realize that they have nowhere to stop this stuff now. So I would much rather see a reality where we're dealing with the facts rather than living in this fantasy and saying, well, I'm going to tell you what to do over here, and even though I can't really, you know, enforce that, I would rather say, okay, well, this is the state of things. How are we going to react to that? That's a much more honest conversation.
Yeah, I read a great piece the other day talking about how government is going to change from this small body of people that are in control of the masses to servicing the people and starting to do what they want. And all those things you've just described are a result of the free market. People don't go out there and build these apps, or VPNs don't take off and become popular unless they're solving a problem that the government has created. And we've got some smart people now developing awesome things, as you say, and the government are in their ivory tower. They are not aware that these things are even out there in a lot of instances, I think.
Absolutely. And when you say that, governments created these problems, tech provides these solutions, you saw that with every wave in Bitcoin. I mean, you saw the first bull run in Bitcoin was the WikiLeaks wave. That's because the government put pressure on intermediaries and stopped donations from going to WikiLeaks. So we needed a solution. WikiLeaks started accepting donations and people flooded over to that market. You saw another issue when you had the ICO wave. The government had gummed up the financial system, made it incredibly hard to do any sort of fundraising publicly. And so with that sort of, it's like molasses, there's nothing, if a company wants capital, then it's just really hard for them to function. So I see ICOs as being like this regulatory arbitrage that occurred because IPOs were completely out of reach for an average company. And so you had another wave. And now you have people flocking over because you have content creators who are being demonetized and kicked off certain platforms. And again, it's the pressure on the payment providers, and sometimes the payment providers themselves putting pressure on other websites. Saying, we do not want to support certain types of people. And then again, more people flocking over to cryptocurrency. But now we're also seeing people flock over to decentralized platforms. So you mentioned library.io. I know that, there are some kind of pseudo decentralized platforms, like BitChute was banned, blocked in Australia because they weren't censoring content. Libraries decentralized, they don't have the ability to censor content on there. It's crazy. You had like platforms like even text platforms like Zero Hedge. So it's amazing what's been happening with Zero Hedge. So first of all, Facebook, like a few weeks ago, maybe a week ago now, they banned Zero Hedge on Facebook, and then Facebook came back a couple of days ago and said, "Oh, it was accidental. We're sorry." But it just was very convenient because Zero Hedge had just put out a bunch of articles that were very critical of Facebook, and then suddenly you couldn't access Zero Hedge articles on Facebook, so that was interesting. And then you had New Zealand and Australia, for the sake of protecting consumers, completely block Zero Hedge because they're allowing free discussion. They never even posted the video of the mosque. They didn't do any of that, but they've been banned in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, and I'm very passionate about Zero Hedge. It's been one of the big parts of my journey over the past 10 years or so into finding non-mainstream information. They first wrote about Bitcoin in 2012. They cover topics that you're not going to read elsewhere, and there's a lot of stuff that can be exaggerated over there, but there's some good stuff there as well. And by blocking those websites, again, you just kind of make the younger generation say, well, hold on, why aren't we allowed to talk about that? Then they're going to find it on a different website, or they're going to share it peer-to-peer on an encrypted messaging app. You're not blocking that content from being out there in the real world.
And what you are doing is you're hampering a real discussion about this. Like sometimes they're blocking content. Like let's say they block someone who's an idiot, right? And they say, you can't listen to this idiot because what they're saying is idiotic. So then that kind of gets blocked out. No one can hear from idiot A, we'll call them. But
Alex
then,
Jones.
yeah, all right. But then someone discovers idiot A, right? And they discover them in some underground forum, and there's not much discussion about it, but it just kind of seems cagey, and they can't get too much information because there's not too much information out there because it's been blocked, right? But then instead of recognizing them for what they are as idiot A, they can get co-opted, and they could be like, oh well, maybe that's a good thing. Like you could be turning people over to the wrong side by actually blocking some of this content. Let it be free. Let people discuss it freely. Have smart people debate this stuff. People can choose their own sides, and discover for themselves whether things are idiotic or not.
And that's why I do bring up Alex Jones, because look at how he's been treated by a lot of those sites.
Right.
And then someone like Joe Rogan says, come on my podcast, and it gets tens of millions of views and probably gets you more attention than he otherwise would have got. So the free market always finds a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Zero Hedge, I mean, Zero Hedge also talked a little bit about the Christchurch shootings. So they, in this article, they're talking about Nick Monroe, who wrote a piece for the New Zealand Herald. And it says here that Nick Monroe actually talked about this article, that where they forced Nick Monroe to delete a large number of tweets, first of all, that Twitter did. And then his article in the New Zealand Herald was censored in a very strange way. So the sentence that was deleted was a well-known Muslim local chased off shooters and fired 2 shots at them as they sped off. And the New Zealand Herald deleted this in a very stealthy way. The article went out, this was in the original version, and then they republished it without letting him know, and took those sentences out. Why aren't we allowed to talk about this stuff? Like, I mean, is it because it seemed too pro guns that someone was, fighting off the shooter? I mean, it just seems very strange, right? Why cherry pick all this stuff that's allowed to get disseminated? Why all this censorship and caginess around the facts? Let's get them all out there and decide things for ourselves.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. What goes through their head sometimes when they think like that? But people are having these discussions, whether it's in their own lounge room at home or online in a different forum. So why can't it be discussed in the mainstream as well? Just seems like they can't control the narrative, and that's the rush to shut it down before it spreads. But I think this is going to be part of history, and people are going to want to read about this. And obviously, we don't want to put those extremists on a pedestal and whatnot. But geez, I don't know the right answer. There's some good questions coming in the chat about net neutrality as well.
Yeah, it's I mean, net neutrality in America. It's that was a debate. I actually did a video with Perry Metzger talking about that. He's a security expert here in the States, and he was actually the person who, you guys have seen him on the show because I've interviewed him a bunch of times, about net neutrality, about the release of Bitcoin. He runs the mailing list where Bitcoin was first released. But we talked about net neutrality. That's just a can of worms right there, because it was kind of held up as this idea of, free information, and don't let these internet service providers gouge you and censor things and all of this stuff. But it was just a red flag, It's that wasn't what it was really about. It was, I mean, the real underlying issue is that we basically have a cartel, a government-enforced cartel of internet service providers, and severe lack of competition in the market. So that's an issue, and that's a government-created issue right there. So it seems that net neutrality was just kind of this band-aid on a wound that government created. But that's a whole nother can of worms to talk about.
And there's plenty of blockchain projects out there that are trying to build decentralized internet now, and some of them are getting fairly close.
Absolutely. I mean, I've interviewed Colin Cantrell from Nexus. They want to do that. They're launching satellites into space to make sure that not all information is relayed through the same satellites, can then be filtered because of that. So things like that are very, very interesting. It goes back to what you were saying before. We become very resourceful as soon as we're backed into a corner, and governments make dumb decisions that make our lives worse, and so we try to find solutions for that. Smart people, especially people in tech, which has been a fairly unregulated industry, although it's getting worse and worse as we go. People in tech, they've just been so great at staying a few steps ahead of the curve and staying nimble and flexible and responsive to the world, and giving us market solutions for things that people desire. And people do desire freedom of information. Otherwise, VPNs wouldn't be a thing. Decentralized platforms wouldn't be a thing. Decentralized money wouldn't be a thing. Clearly this is something that people are interested in, but maybe not enough people.
Yeah, and each time taxis say to Uber, you can't do that, and they appeal to the authorities, and then hotels say you can't do that to Airbnb, the banks say you can't do that to Bitcoin, and people, especially the tech industry, are renowned for testing those boundaries and saying, well, hey, we've already done this.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just checking my Bitbacker. If you guys wanted to send any questions, you're welcome to send them through the Bitbacker Power Chat. I will send that link now into the chat, so you can See that if you want. So I mean, there's a lot going on. We haven't even covered some of the things going on in Australia that just make it kind of this scary nanny state. We alluded a little bit to their treatment of drugs, which is just really backward. To the censorship, to the encryption side of things. Then you had like things like in New Zealand where you're forced to give your PIN code and your password to all your digital devices as you enter. And if you don't, then you get fined and your devices get taken off you anyway for forensic testing. So that's something to also keep in mind when you're visiting New Zealand.
There was a famous video on Facebook from an Aussie guy as well who just returned through Sydney, and they took all his devices. He even thought they installed something on his laptop, had to ask him to unlock all.
I would presume that they did. I mean, if I were that guy, I would just get all new devices, or I would not take any of my devices that I use across national boundaries. I don't think that it's something that's particular to Australia and New Zealand. I think this is something that, governments all over the world are doing more and more. It's a power thing, and it's sort of couched as this protection mechanism whereby they control the inflow of data and they can keep eyes on everything going on and they'll keep you safe. But really, that's a huge trade-off. First of all, it doesn't keep people safe. These things happen all the time, and second of all, it's such a huge sacrifice when you're giving up your freedom, and people are often dismissive of it, especially if it's not something that they've really thought about before, or if they've ever been on the bad side of a bank or the bad side of a government for in an unjustified way. People don't realize how authoritarian and awful and repressive it can be to live under a government that is what's the word I'm looking for? That is, I mean,
suppressive.
Yeah, just being oppressive against you. Like it's so makes you feel so vulnerable to be in a situation where you have such a complete lack of control, and lots of people don't even realize that. I kind of dismiss it as this thing like, oh well, I've got nothing to hide, I don't care, maybe you're doing something bad, maybe you shouldn't be using this system that's cloaked, maybe you should go and use the traditional financial system and all of these things. And it's just such a naive comment, because we've seen how quickly freedom can be lost. I mean, you even look in the United States with how the IRS deals with people. If there are certain political factions in particular that the government doesn't like, you will just see them be audited. Now, that doesn't seem like a big thing. Oh, audited. So if you're not doing anything dodgy, that's fine. Just give your receipts. No, because everything gets frozen. You don't have access to your assets. You have to provide like crazy detailed records. Like your life goes on hold sometimes for years while you go through this. You lost years of your life to this. This destroys people's businesses. It destroys people's families. This is not some slight small thing that people should deal with. But you can just see, like, when people have access to information, when they're keeping data centers filled with like metadata of things that they might potentially be able to use against you one day. Like, all you need to do is upset them, and then they have this treasure trove of things that to use against you.
I think people are wising up to this, and with Bitcoin we can start to memorize those 12 seed words in our head to control our own data, and people are going to get smarter and smarter at realizing there's things that they need to keep private from the government. And I think the war on cash is something we haven't touched on today, but broader with the economic conditions, I think in the next downturn a lot of countries are going to have to go into negative interest rates, and that's going to be the ultimate war on cash, where you're going to have to use that system. And as you say, once that is in place, then what happens when the power goes down, or what happens when they freeze your account and all of a sudden you can't buy food because you're suspicion of doing something, or as you say, getting audited, and everything's just frozen for that period of time. And the free market are going to develop things that's going to send more people to Bitcoin and find alternate ways to become their own bank or store their own data.
Absolutely. I just want to give a huge shout out to John Doe, who sent me through 2 super chats and said, thank you for your awesome content. You're a big contributor in the crypto world. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you. That's so lovely of you. And I just want to mention, so Lost on the Pancake said in the chat, 1984 was supposed to not be a guideline. And that kind of hits the nail on the head. You know, you have a lot of authors who've written about this dystopian future where the government does these terrible things. How do people rise up? It ends up being the story of this heroism from the individuals who stand up to fight this regime, right? And now we look at where we are now with all of the surveillance going on, all of the curtailing of freedoms and choices and sharing of information that we're seeing. And it's atrocious, right? And it's just like, we really do need people to be speaking out more about this. You know, if decisions are made by the politicians that you elect, maybe they are, maybe it's all just a completely rigged system, but at the very least we can be vocal about this. You know, whether it actually changes the opinion of the politicians, I don't know, but maybe it changes the opinion of your peers, and maybe it starts to get more people interested in this stuff, and they start to talk about it and question some of the things that they've taken for granted before. I think that's what we need more in society. We need less shutting down of discussions, less shaming of people who bring up certain topics of conversation, less kicking people off platforms and, you know, and saying, yay, we're all thinking exactly the same way, we kicked off those terrible people, and more engaging in dialogue and discussing these things and making sure that we are keeping an eye on what the government is doing. It's like the frog in the boiling water, right? You know, it doesn't notice that the water is getting hotter and hotter until it's too late and it's boiled to death, because it doesn't notice the temperature change. And that's where we're at the moment. The temperature is getting warmer and warmer. We're losing more and more of our rights and freedoms and autonomy and privacy. And we're just like this happy frog saying, oh, well, this is a nice lukewarm bath, isn't it? It's kind of terrifying.
I think one of the big changes we are going to see, as I said before, is government starting to serve people rather than control people. And a lot of countries that have done this well in Northern Europe, for example, are starting to elect officials that are experts in each field. So instead of having politicians decide how to run the health system, politicians decide how to run the banks, we start to elect people that are experts in their field, really well qualified, experienced, all that sort of thing. And I think we're just going to see a big shift to the sort of people that want to become a politician or want to become, you know, a central banker, who often haven't run a business in the real world and have that experience. So I think that people are going to ask more, and we're starting to see those countries that have made changes in education systems and positions of power that are reaping the rewards.
Yeah, I do want to mention in the chat, so I can't pronounce this name, the Revakis 2790. I like that they their response after the super chat that I got was, uh-oh, you didn't use Bitbacker. So that's another thing. Like, there are lots of fiat alternatives out there, and that's one thing that I bring up in the crypto space, because I have so many friends who are YouTubers, content creators, they write articles, etc., and they rely on things like Patreon, that has a terrible track record with their biases and curtailing and censoring certain content. Again, private platform, they can do what they want. But if there are alternatives out there that we can be supporting, then I think that that's definitely a good thing. And there are lots of content creation sites where you can be supporting people. I use Bitbacker. I'm working closely with Bitbacker. They accept all kinds of cryptocurrency, and they don't take 30% like Google does. And they don't deplatform people, and they can't get pressured by intermediaries and payment providers like MasterCard and Visa and Stripe, like places like Subscribestar could, where they just pulled services from the entire platform. When you're paying peer-to-peer in cryptocurrency, that money goes directly to who you want it to go to. So it's just so great to know that there are alternatives out there now that are decentralized, that you can use things like cryptocurrency, and things like, you know, library.io. Like, we covered this on the Stossel show a couple of years ago, because what happened was, I mean, there are all these places, there's censorship as well, and Library mirrored a bunch of sites, put a bunch of content out there so that it was available for use. They do some really awesome things. So I encourage everyone, even as a backup, even if you're not using it every day, like I upload to about a dozen sites all of my content, you know, and it's just because I know that if I get kicked off Twitter or if I get kicked off YouTube, which isn't far-fetched at all, then I have all of these places where my videos are still available for people to see on these decentralized platforms where they can't be taken down.
Yeah, we got kicked off Facebook last year because, as I said, I'm a pharmacist, and I shared an article and made a video about something I'm really passionate about, and that's trials with MDMA for post-traumatic stress. And somehow that was deemed, someone reported that content, and you kicked off Facebook for 2 weeks for sharing literally a scientific article about MDMA being used for post-traumatic stress disorder. So I
What? You
agree
got
that
you got kicked off Facebook for that?
2 week ban for that. Yeah, yeah.
What?
Like I
So
said, I
I've
was
done an
literally-
article about that exact thing. I have a video that I shot at the Satoshi Roundtable last year, and I interviewed someone who was leading that sort of research. Is incredible. Like I mean, just a personal story. I don't take drugs and I don't really drink, and I'm not really into that. Just as a personal choice, and to curtail talk about what's going on in drug research is stupid and hurting a lot of people, because it's very clear that there are so many things that we just deem bad because they're drugs or whatever, and don't even actually look at the science behind it. And it is very clear that things like MDMA are helping reset people's neural pathways to teach them how to recover from things like PTSD. It's incredible. The lives that they're helping with this sort of research is incredible. So that's awful that you were shut down for that. I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, people do it all the time for other things. It just is really sad.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think pharmacists and drugs should be regulated. There should be more education, better rehab, and then all of a sudden, the street price of cocaine doesn't go from $300 an ounce as it is in Australia and create this huge black market and all this crime. It's controlled, and the outcomes show us that that is the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just looking at some of the things that the private internet service providers in Australia and New Zealand have
You
said.
dropped out there.
Oh no! Can you hear me?
I'm not sure if that's...
Oh no! Am I back? Am I back now?
I think you're back now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, my internet sometimes is just like, screw you, and just goes away. Or maybe it's the NSA that's just like, she's talking about MDMA again. We have to shut that down before people get cured from PTSD, and then where will all of our big pharma money go? I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. It does seem like it is a scary landscape at the moment. A lot of people immediately jumping on the bandwagon and saying, oh, bad video, of course it should be blocked, or this. How about allowing individual platforms to decide whether they want to, support certain things, like having a government that is powerful enough to make decisions about what information can and can't be shared is a dangerous precedent. Now, we're dealing with an extreme case right now, so it seems like, oh, well, it's a really bad video, so obviously this is the correct choice. But it's the principle underlying this that we need to be aware of, and a lot of people are dismissing that. And it's not good enough to put that power in the hands of a bunch of politicians and have them make the decision and the final call, because people are corruptible and people make mistakes, and people have their own private agendas as well. And what you have when you start to put this power in the hands of politicians is people abusing that power, and you just see it over and over again. You see it in the Australian government and the New Zealand government, and God, in the American government, and all over the world, people trying to shut down the speech or silence their opponents. You've seen it all throughout the history of America, where you had one president get in, and then as soon as the next president comes in, he'd be like, oh, well, I'm banishing the guy who came before me. And it's like, it just doesn't lead to good things. And we need to really take a step back and not be thinking just about this particular use case, but think about the power that we're putting in the hands of these politicians. And if we're not happy about that, if we're not happy about them, perhaps turning and silencing the people that we agree with later down the track, then maybe we shouldn't be giving them this power in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's a famous example of politicians doing the opposite of what they say. And I think Obama said he was going to halve the national debt, and he successfully managed to double it in his time. So do the opposite of what they say. But Naomi, I do have to rush off soon. So any final thoughts? I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation.
Yeah, today. No, I really appreciated you coming on. So Ventian mentioned they sent through a power chat. I didn't receive that, but one thing that Bitbacker has is if you go to your drop-down menu, it says recover coins, use the same browser that you sent it. It may just be stuck in your browser, because sometimes browsers are shit. So they have that recovery option in case it got stuck there. So you can try that again. Let me know how you go. Otherwise, send me a DM and I'll walk you through that. Otherwise, thank you so much. I really appreciate appreciate you being here, Alex. And huge thank you to John Doe for the super chat. Really appreciate that. And to everyone who's watching this through Bitbacker, I also appreciate you guys doing that. But thanks to everyone in the chat, and thanks for the conversation, Alex. And hopefully we can get people to, you know, be moved to action about this and maybe start to talk about this more and not be scared into submission about this topic.
Awesome. I really appreciate you having me on, and we'll have to have you back on Nuggets News in the future as well.
Absolutely. Let's do that. Lovely chatting.
See ya.
See ya.